One of the interesting things for history, and one of the reasons why I like doing these occasional alternate history questions when they are set by patrons, is that it allows you to explore the actual history as well, and you look at it and you can understand why they went the way they did. And one of the really interesting questions I've got is what happens to World War One if the Royal Navy got a full Admiralty staff when the General Staff came to be? And the thing is, you can't really say much about necessarily World War One itself, but you can certainly say a lot about the run up to World War One, because there's all sorts of interesting reasons why the Royal Navy doesn't get the same kind of formal staff that the Army had, doesn't get the same kind of structure. And in some ways that's because it didn't need it, because it already had other things filling that function. But the trouble is, those things which were filling function weren't necessarily fit for purpose in the modern world. They'd been an evolution of existing things to deal with. In fact, that's one of the interesting things. The Royal Navy has been consistently, slowly modernizing itself throughout the 19th century, slowly in staff functions, etc., slowly building itself up to structure, slowly building up staff, slowly building up things. But because of the organizations that it starts out with and how they come about, those staffs don't necessarily work in the way they need to win the modern political game that the Royal Navy finds itself in the beginning of the 20th century. They can win part of the game. They can win the public side in terms of press releases, in terms of how you speak to press, how you portray yourself in the media. They can do that pretty darn well. The We Want 8 campaign is a good example for battleships. But honestly, when it comes to the government campaign, they can't. They're not set up to. They're used to government ministers taking what they say as gospel. And the thing is, the reforms of the army meant that the army was not competing on that as a playground anymore. The army was doing regular briefings, regular work. And the reason this is, and getting into this, is that, the difference in the reforms the army goes through versus the reforms the Navy probably needs. And it all starts off with the Boer War and the Isha report. Now, Isha is a very, very interesting character, but it's true for pretty much all of British history. When governments want a report that they're actually going to act upon, they call in a historian. If in doubt, word goes out and a historian gets called in. Not because necessarily they're writing the only report, but because what a historian tends to be very good at doing is taking the words and the reports and information of others and converting it into standard linguistics and a standard format so that lots of people can read and understand all the synthesized information. And that's pretty much what this report does. Isha's report takes all the issues of the Boer War and starts working out what the problems were for the army, what the situations they created themselves in, what the war officer got itself into, the logistical issues, the organizational issues, the structural issues, why they'd had the problems they'd had in the Boer War. And in many ways, the reason the British Army is in the position it is at the beginning of World War One, where it actually is quite a dominant political factor in terms of government, but also has managed to build itself up into a reputable army that the government feels comfortable deploying into the European theatre, is because of the experience of the Boer War, is because of the issues they suffered there, and is because of the lessons they learnt. And it comes back to Isha's report. The things it recommends are expanding the War Office, creating an Army Council along the lines of the Naval Board, which the Navy already has, a General Staff to support them, and a Chief of the General Staff to replace the Commander-in-Chief of the Forces. And expanding the War Office, again, they want more civil servants, they don't want a larger civil service. Again, the Admiralty has had a senior civil servant for a long time, has had a civil service backing up for a long, long time. The famous diarist, Sir Samuel Pepys, was exactly that. He wasn't a naval officer, he was a civil servant in the Admiralty. So, in many ways, what the War Office is doing, what the Isha report is doing, is looking at the problems in the army and looking at the navy as the basis for their improvements. This is one of the weird things people don't sometimes realize. They go, "Oh, they're aping Germany." No, specifically, the report is often citing this is what the navy does. This is how the navy runs it. So, in many ways, they're doing a similar thing with the Admiralty as Bofors did with the pom pom. They're taking the bits from the pom-pom which they liked and are improving it to the point to fit the brief they need to do to make it better for the period coming in. And this is the problem. Whereas the Navy's been doing slow evolutionary adaptation and has been adapting as they need to and evolving themselves, and it's been keeping up to pace, this is going to be the Army jumping ahead. So the Army reached the point you need to be in realistically for the first half of the 20th century in about the first 10 years, between 1905 and 1910 of the 20th century. Whereas the Navy really take till about the end of the war, end of World War One, and they've got a war staff functioning and it's giving out briefings and doing all the things it needs to do. Now, with this being said, let's consider what these components were. Well, these components were implemented through the Haldane reforms. So, it's important to think it's not just Isha's idea. Isha writes a report, goes to a government, but that government isn't really there to implement it, and it's Haldane, Sir Richard Haldane, who comes in and implements them. And he implements them alongside a whole range of other reforms to the British Army, and growing the British Army and strengthening the British Army and making it a more capable organisation, a more resilient organisation. Now, the thing is, the Haldane reforms, often people, what they're talking about when they're getting into them, are the creation of a territorial army, the creation expeditionary force, but realistically these are all built upon the Isha report and things like the Officer Training Corps improvements and the Imperial General Staff. Now the Imperial General Staff is interesting because this does definitely copy the Royal Navy, and the idea is you bring together staffs and officers from all over the empire and have them work together to form a unified policy for the army. And that was what the Imperial General Staff was about. It was to serve as a common link between these forces, linking the dominions, linking the various parts of the empire together into one unified military force with similar doctrines, similar capabilities. Developed locally, of course, and with their own local spirit, etc., but able to logistically work together was the aim. And of course, the service which was primarily doing this, and was really doing this a lot, was the Royal Navy. The Royal Navy had been spending a lot of effort in doing it. It had been sending officers out to the dominions to help them grow their navies, help them advise them. Australia was a prime example and was very good where this went very well. Canada was an example where this didn't go that well. In India, they had a problem in that every time they were trying to invest there, the British Army in India got upset because, well, that might distract from the army, which was the centre point and the cornerstone of their ability to work. It was an entire UK political issue writ large. But leaving that to one side, the Haldane reforms also include this creation of strengthening of the War Office, the Imperial General Staff, and strengthening the Army Board, etc., and all the personnel beneath them to allow them to minister the force and work within the force, and also, more importantly, to be comprehensively and regularly briefing the political powers that be in the UK of the capabilities, of the requirements of the army, of the reasons for their development, and of their plans. Not down to the minutiae, not down to train timetables and those things, but what the concept of operation was. They weren't relying on them reading books, they weren't relying on them going listening to historical debate and discussion, they were going out and briefing them. And this was being carried on continuously from 1905 till 1912. And it carries on after that, of course. But Haldane is taking the lead in 1905 to 1912, doing this and inspiring this. And this is a different thing. Whereas the Navy is relying on people understanding the Navy, and, all the books and things going out, they will understand the naval strength and will talk to them at parties and events. The army is realistically providing people with pieces of paper, briefings, documents, things to them to learn from. So they start thinking about things in terms of an army framework. This is important, okay? One of the things you learn when you're talking about warfare and warfighting and the concept of conventional deterrence and how you manage peacetime in terms of conflict management is you are often shaping the battlefield, shaping the battle space by your actions in peacetime, building alliances, building infrastructure, all these things. You start shaping the thought process of both your allies and your opponents into how they are going to think about things, how they're going to approach things, what the kind of language they use to describe things. These are deep-seated efforts to try and shape the battle space and ensure it's best suited to your means and your methodology. These briefings, these reports, that's exactly what they're doing. They are shaping the battle space, which is the minds of the leadership of the UK, into a frame of reference which fits the army's arguments. This is the only way they can begin to compete with the Navy and its overwhelming political power, because for the Empire, for national security, for trade, everything is about the Navy, obviously. Everything is obviously about Navy, and that's to accept what the Navy relies on. And the army still in the march by going, well, if we keep briefing them, we can shape it so the army, the expeditionary force, the focus on the continental Europe, the focus on empire policing is what people think about. They forget about the bit in the middle, the fact that we need Navy to get anywhere. No. That's of course, that's the Navy's job. That'll be done by the Navy. They're great. But we're showing them what we're going to do. So they think about what we're doing first before they think about the Navy. And that's a very powerful tool of political argument and of administration for the army. So in short, the army that results, the army structure, A, is in a beautiful building. They're already in one, but it's a beautiful building. B, they have a general staff that's probably constituted as such that is producing the staff work, producing the paper, supporting them, working out how to coordinate all these different forces around the world and trying to bring them together. It's constantly frustrated by politicians and constantly frustrated by the tyranny of distance and geography, but it's trying. It's actually working on it. And they have an army council. They have a repository of senior officers to run things and organise things and work things through with. This is a far better position than the army was back in the 1890s. This is a far better position than they have been at any point since the end, arguably, since the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Because they haven't really been forced to change. The wars they fought have not challenged them enough and have not forced them to grow. One of the things you do find is that a huge amount of this is dominated by officers from the engineering corps. And the Royal Engineers, lovely people, the only ones who the army can turn to who have actually passed exams, who are actually sure can do maths. Them and the artilleries. And surprisingly, they prove very dominant. Very, very dominant in this new structure. It's amazing. Because they actually have the training. In contrast, what was the Navy structure? Okay, so the Navy structure has been being built for quite a while. I've talked about it a bit before, the various Sea Lords and what they're doing getting up to. And realistically, you have... There's a dispute as to... The second Sea Lord tends to outrank the third Sea Lord in terms of their naval rank. But in terms of what their remit and what they're covering, the second Sea Lord is responsible for personnel, the third Sea Lord is responsible for technology, construction, maintenance, and refit. And that is the differential. They are responsible for pretty much everything. And then you have the office of the fourth Sea Lord, logistics. They are the logistics lord. They are responsible for making sure the Navy has the supplies flowing around the world. Basically, the moment it gets into service and is now operating, it's not in refit, Fourth Sea Lord is now responsible for supplying it. And second Sea Lord is responsible for manning it. But the moment it's in refit, or being constructed, or being conceived, or developed, it's under the third Sea Lord's remit. And the first Sea Lord is, of course, responsible for using it. Now, the first Sea Lord doesn't really have much in office themselves, but they do have the Naval Intelligence Department. Okay, here is the classic example of things which have been gradually evolved over time. The Naval Intelligence Department had been formed when the Committee for Imperial Defence had been set up. And it was the Royal Navy's submission to it, and it's called the Intelligence Foreign Division. I do love that, the Intelligence Foreign Division. And that's what starts out first. And then, well, they start working out, we need plans for how to get ready for war. Well, okay, who do we give that to? We'll give that to the Mobilization Division as part of the Naval Intelligence Department. Alright, and if we want to mobilize, what are they going to do? Well, we'll give them to the War Division. We'll have set up a War Division, the War Strategy and Defence Division, as part of the Naval Intelligence Department. And the Trade, Protection and Merchant Shipping Division as part of the Naval Intelligence Department. And what is the problem? You have all these departments. This is a great thing. They're all part of the departments. What are they part of? The Naval Intelligence Department. And what do intelligence officers do? They're paranoid. They don't want to give information out to anyone, lest the enemy gets any good information. They don't want to tell the enemy they have information about them. They don't want to do anything which reveals their sources, anything which reveals their plans. They will not do, because they're an intelligence department. It's hard baked into them. And this is the problem. The Royal Navy has a staff, but to get that staff to share information with anyone, you would literally have to drag them across hot coals, and they still might not share anything. This is why when it comes to the building race, the Royal Navy's very good at the press. Why? Third Sea Lord. That's his department. When it comes to their personnel, their crewing and their personnel reforms, Second Sea Lord. Again, good explaining it. When it comes to their need of supplies around the world and making the case to Parliament, very good. Fourth Sea Lord goes off and does it. Naval Intelligence Department, we don't talk to people. We are the Navy's Navy. We keep quiet. We are the silent and the silent service. And that's the problem. They don't talk. They don't go and tell anyone. They don't want to communicate because they're an intelligence division. They are literally an intelligence division. And this is the problem. This is the Royal Navy's issue. This is what they are constantly dealing with, in that they have these things. But they're not using them. So this is why some people will argue, well, the Navy did have a staff. So, you're talking it wrong, Alex. They had a staff. So what is this an alternate history of? Basically, if this staff was being reorganized at this time, this staff would not have ended up there. The Naval Intelligence Department should not have evolved like it has. The moment you've got it and you're going, we're just adding into them, it's easy to do, but it's not what should be done. If you were doing a root and branch reform and you're setting up these formations, half these units would not be under intelligence, and intelligence would have to be grouped specifically under a certain Sea Lord who would then specifically be overseeing it. They're not reporting to the board, they're reporting to a Sea Lord. And there's only one Sea Lord they can realistically report to. So realistically, what we're talking about is making the changes which almost happen later anyway with the Admiralty War Staff when it's created. Later on, almost immediately upon World War I, there's an Admiralty War Staff starts to be created. And it's really evolved during the war, during World War I. And broadly speaking, what happens is it's the slow dismantling of the Naval Intelligence Department into an actual war staff, into an actual Admiralty staff. Because they are de facto the Admiralty staff, they're just an intelligence division. It's kind of like if you decided instead of having the Pentagon, you had the CIA doing the job for the Pentagon. CIA never wants to share any information, ever, with anyone. They don't. They're intelligence officers. They don't want to do it. So would they be writing good briefings or explaining stuff for the Pentagon? No. I can't give a UK example because, well, we have one. This is the thing. This is why I went for the American example as the option. And so why would the Royal Navy change in 1904? Well, 1904, 1905. Well, that's the problem. Why would they change? They're very successful at slowly evolving and very successful at capturing ministers. And a classic example is the current head of the intelligence department at this point is Battenberg, is Prince Louis Battenberg. He's the head of the Naval Intelligence Department. He's doing an excellent job running it. He is basically running, if you consider what he's in charge of at this point, he's in charge of their intelligence division, he's in charge of their mobilization division, their war strategy division, defense division, he's in charge of trade protection, he's organizing all the preparations for World War I, all the schemes, all the strategies are coming from Battenberg. They're not Fishers, they're not anyone else, it's Battenberg, it's just, he's the head of the Naval Intelligence Department, so of course he doesn't tell anyone about it. But internal reform, it was happening, but honestly, it's happening very, very slowly. It's happening very slowly, and I've called it the Intelligence Division here because that's realistically what it should have been. It should not have been the department, it should have been in division. And it should have been part of one of the Sea Lord's briefs, but it wasn't. It was made a department. And a department is kind of like a US Navy bureau at that time. They are all powerful and everything's internal. So, external reform. That's the only real option. Standardizing the forces is a way to get reforms. Honestly, as said, this leads to the intelligence department being split. It will lead to them being split into functioning what would be an intelligence staff, operations staff, and general staff. But it would have to be an external reform. And this brings up a very specific problem. Because who would do it in this period? Who would be able to reform the Navy without being captured by the Navy? Well, believe it or not, there is an option. And it's not Churchill. So, if we're doing the starting point as Haldane for the army, then we have to consider who's in the cabinet with him and who's in the cabinet, who's viably in the cabinet at the time. And, well, Churchill isn't. But that doesn't really matter because there is someone made president of the Board of Trade. It's called David Lloyd George. And please note, I'm not going to claim he's an ardent militarist. He isn't. He prefers peace and he would like to cut spending on defense. He really would. But he is also a reformer. And he's not... It's not that he wants to cut the fence completely. He isn't that scenario. He isn't, we should all cut the fence in the world to be peaceful. He does not necessarily biggest fan of empire. But he works within the structure he's got available. He wants to get it better. He wants to change things. He wants to make them better. Now, one of the interesting things about Lloyd George is if he is there, he's not going to be swayed around by the admirals. But he has a lot of interesting ideas. And a lot of things he does false. One of the things he does while he is Prime Minister later in the war is he forces the Royal Navy to give weekly briefs to Cabinet. Weekly briefing documents to politicians. He has them set up and do the weekly briefs, explaining strategy, explaining what they're doing, explaining how their operations in the past week have gone and how their operations in the next week are going to fit in with their overall strategy. It's a very beautiful point, and it's made rather well, I would have to say this, in Andy Boyd's book. Andrew Boyd's British Naval Intelligence through the 20th century. I've got the paperback and the hardback version. The paperback's been sent to me to review. It's a good book. It is a good book. But if we use the example here, he puts it, the first Naval Weekly Appreciation for the Cabinet requested by Lloyd George at the Admiralty meeting on the 30th of April covered the week ending 27th of May. And they were issued weekly thereafter until the end of the war. The first one opened with a concise summary of current British naval strategy, identifying the 4 strategic goals, 2 offensive and 2 defensive. Protecting the sea communications of British and Allied armies, especially the primary offensive theatre in France, eliminating enemy trade to undermine enemy military capability and popular will to fight, protecting British and Allied trade, preventing invasion raids directed at the United Kingdom. Now, isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? And believe it or not, that's the sort of documents which Lloyd George likes to have produced by the departments he runs on a monthly basis, working out, explaining his case, just as the Army, just as Haldane does for the Army. Producing these briefing documents, telling people what you're doing, why you're doing it, explaining it every month or concisely, so they get an idea and get the framework. So the thing is, Lloyd George is a pretty good choice. And if they had been going to reform the Navy as well as the Army, there are few ministers who would have been capable of taking on the Navy machine and managing them. But Lloyd George would be. So the only real option, if we're going to have this reform happen in this period, is an external reform, i.e. a politician being put in charge, and the only real option from the cabinet, i.e. members who are trusted enough by the administration, by that party in power, the Liberals, to run it, is probably Lloyd George. David Lloyd George, the fiery Welshman. And that leads to all sorts of interesting things. So this is what we're going to do. We're going to look through and go, well, let's say Lloyd George is made First Lord of the Admiralty with a reforming agenda. What happens? What happens to the Royal Navy? With that being said, it's Shameless Book Plug time. Now, it's a Shameless Book Plug time. Now, for those who don't know, this is usually the point at which I say thank you to everyone for liking, sharing, and subscribing, and plug my book, shamelessly. And other books are coming soon. As soon as I'm through all the paperwork and everything sorted out, soon they're coming. But also, it's usually the divider point where if people don't like alternate history, they get to leave. They can go, right, and if you don't like alternate history, we've just discussed the history. After this is going to be the alternate history. So, to those two people who always watch past this point and then complain going, I hate alternate histories, I've watched the whole way through, why were you doing alternate history? I'd say this every time we get to this point. I think you probably skipped the Shameless Book Plug part and therefore don't realise. So, frankly, it's on you. I have a warning. I can't do anything more. I really can't. Also, it's a patron-requested topic. The whole point of having them is the patrons suggest them, then the patrons vote for which ones I do, and then I do them. And in return, the patrons very nicely financially support this channel. Like everyone watching this channel does, but, and everyone who's a member of the channel, these things do. That's the way the patrons do it. So, of course I'm going to do this video, because it's a patron-requested video. Anyway, thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, supporting, and helping the channel grow. It really does mean a lot to me the way this channel keeps growing, and thank you. Thank you ever so much. Right then. So what would the new naval structure look like? Well, I've left the 3rd Sea Lord where they are. I've left the 2nd Sea Lord to an extent where they are. Those departments are pretty much going to be left the same way they are. Now, the thing is, there is a role called Additional Civil Lord of the Admiralty, who is another MP. Usually you have the First Lord and the Civil Lord as your 2 MPs. I've introduced it so you should have 3. You should have 3. The 3rd one comes in at times like World War I, etc. But realistically, there should be the 3rd one in there from the get-go to help with communication with ministers and also to give the Navy slightly more strength when it comes to their bench in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. Or rather, the House of Commons at this point. The House of Lords has enough ex-naval officers in there. It's fine. First Lord of the Admiralty. President of the Board is an MP. That would be what the job which Lloyd George would be doing. Office of the First Sea Lord, Admiral, a general or coordinating staff which also has specific governance of strategy, defence and mobilisation. Those are very sensible to stick there. They're very sensible to stick there. Okay? That department starts, then you can start having briefings going out. The Civil Lord of the Admiralty, responsible for overseeing the civilian side of the Admiralty and its holdings. Believe it or not, that position tends to culminate quite nicely with the office of the Second Sea Lord. You can actually start to see what are the public-facing Sea Lords, and oh, there is an MP for them. The officer, the additional Civil Lord of the Admiralty, the MP, an MP responsible for overseeing contracts and commitments. Office of Third Sea Lord, Technology, Construction, Maintenance and Refit. So you can tell which one are they working with. Which pairs of ministers and naval officers work together. Office of the Fourth Sea Lord, Logistics and Trade Protection. Very sensible those two organisations go together. If one's planning logistics, the other one, planning logistics, but also planning trade protection operations can go together quite nicely. You can start working that out. You can run it all as a rather large logistics operation, which is actually what they end up doing when they're forming the convoy system, etc. It is people from the Fourth Sea Lord's office who come out and start running it. So it makes perfect sense to put them. And I've created a Fifth Sea Lord, and they are in charge of the Intelligence Division. And the reason they are a Sea Lord is they have a seat at the table. And intelligence now goes through them. They have a seat at the table. And then what you would have is every month a briefing goes out to ministers, and maybe a reduced document goes out to all MPs and members of the House of Lords, which will have discussions about what each of those Sea Lords departments have been doing, with covers from the ministers. We'll cover note from the minister at the beginning of each one. And that's what you should have going on. That's basically what Lloyd George institutes during World War I, when he's Prime Minister. That is pretty much what he institutes. But it's on a weekly basis, so it's not quite as comprehensive. But if it's on a monthly basis in peacetime, it could be. The Intelligence Division, the Fifth Sea Lord, will be producing estimates of what they think, what issues are going up. Probably the Fifth Sea Lord's briefings would not go out to MPs. It would go out to members of the Committee for Imperial Defence and go out to cabinet members where appropriate. But all the rest could do. All the other things from the office, Fourth Sea Lord, etc., all those stuff could go out in various forms, reduced forms to pretty much, or full forms to cabinet ministers and members of Parliament, and start briefing them exactly what the Navy's up to and why the Navy's doing it. Now, this is a reorganisation which the Royal Navy would achieve over very quickly, because let's be honest, they have pretty much all that staff there. I have quite literally reorganised the Naval Intelligence Department and spread it around people. And I promoted probably Battenberg himself to the Fifth Sea Lord post. And this makes sense. It's a very simple reorganisation. It's not a massive it's not a massive change of history, but it changes the fact that the First Sea Lord has a staff and is responsible for general coordination staff and also specific governance of strategy, defence, and mobilisation. So they have to have those papers, and they're going to have to talk about it. Now, the thing is, making these changes is easy. Making these changes, it's strokes of pens. But you also think about how they're going to implement them because of who's going to be there. You see, the thing is, we're talking about the same period where HMS Dreadnought is launched. We're talking about the same period where Lord Fisher is First Sea Lord. And we're putting in Lloyd George as the Minister, as the First Lord of the Admiralty. This is going to lead to some fireworks. Ardent imperialist, support of the empire, lukewarm on empire. However, it would also be very interesting because what you're basically saying, and I think Fisher would get behind this, and this reform event after he's put up the necessary obstructions. The reason he'd get behind it is because it's going to give him a chance to communicate more and more effectively control the information flowing into government and therefore affect government policy. And once he lights on that, he's going to love it. Because he's going to have the ability to better influence government policy. With Lloyd George, well, for him, what does he want? He wants a reduction in naval spending, but he also doesn't want Britain to lose its place in the world. He considers Britain should be number one in the world. He is quite assertive on that one. I think it'd be kind of interesting what his effect. HMS Dreadnought is going to be built as she was. There is nothing that's going to change about that. But what comes next could be intriguing. What comes next could be intriguing because Lloyd George has slightly different values. The ministers who were in post traditionally in this period, especially between 1905 and 1908, basically were captured by the Admiralty. They basically would do what Fisher, etc. told them to. They were not going to offer much resistance. They were not going to question why. Lloyd George would probably ask the question of Fisher, why are you building only one dreadnought? And Fisher would go, well, I'm testing it out, and it's to see if it works, and then, we'll build some more. Okay, fine. But how much a reduction? Where's this reduction coming from? What is the reduction? And is this going to reduce our presence? Because presence is important for trade. And you have to remember, the reason Lloyd George gets the Board of Trade is he's obsessed with trade. It is one of his critical things. He believes in trading with the world. He believes in the flow of goods and flow of trade. And the value he likes for the Royal Navy, the thing he supports the Royal Navy on, is keeping that trade flowing. So his questions and his cross-examination of Fisher is going to be constantly about how is this going to affect trade. You are going to have someone in power in the Admiralty for those 4 years who is focused on not getting control of the sea, but what you do with control of the sea. I mean, him and Corbett are going to go down like a house on fire once they get past their couple of initial disagreements. They are going to really get along. And what becomes interesting in all this is, I honestly think you probably find the Royal Navy's actually building even more cruisers than it did historically. Those are going to be the big impacts. I don't think much changes in terms of the capital ship build, because that is mostly structured with Germany's high sea. Once it becomes a quantitative race between Britain and Germany, that's deciding what's being built and how many are being built, etc. But Lloyd George does love a tech race. He does love tech. One of the interesting things is going to be, what will he think, what will be the legacy be for ship's guns? Will you jump up to 13.5-inch guns? Will you got to go bigger? He is, for many, many things, Lloyd George is someone who is just as obsessed with infrastructure and far more obsessed with infrastructure than modern politicians, but just as obsessed with infrastructure as many of the better politicians are in this period. And is also quite focused on getting security, but also getting peace through strength. Let me explain that. He believes in Britain having enough power that it keeps the world stable so trade can go on, because that is trade and economic growth are the best ways to lift people out of poverty and to improve people's quality of life. Okay? Trade and economic growth. Okay, yes, you have to watch for economic imbalance. This is why when people talk about GDP per capita these days, I find it a bit annoying. And okay, let me explain, just clarify on that one. People are going to say this is modern politics. It isn't. One of the things you will see currently going around is GDP per capita. a lot because it's an arbiter of national financial strength, etc., and economic strength. And it's useful as a quick guide. It's not useful much beyond that. And GDP per capita at the moment produces such figures as people go, well, Mississippi is a higher GDP per capita than Britain. Britain has a 3.8 trillion economy, $1 trillion economy. Mississippi has a $130 billion economy. There is a big difference going on here. Saying it's a GDP per capita is stronger in Mississippi than it is Britain. If Britain's GDP per capita was the same as Mississippi's, with Britain's population and all the scenario, the economy would be even bigger, and Britain would probably be about number 2 economy in the world. There is a certain level at which you have to deal with the realities of the size of your economy. And that's the scenario. And so this is why I've given that thing, because that's the example of GDP per capita which is going around. So why are they not? They're not obsessed with GDP per capita in this period. What they're obsessed with from the economic perspective is the balance of trade and the balance of balance of trade and what we call the flow of material. So the trade has to be flowing. The balance of trade has to be positive. Britain has to be making more money. It hasn't transitioned to a service-based economy at this point. It is starting it, but it's not there. It's still a trade and industrial economy. So that is the important thing. That is the metric they're looking at. Today, we look at GDP per capita. In this period, they are looking at the flow of trade, the flow of goods. The raw materials coming into Britain, the industrial materials flowing out of Britain. That is what they're looking at. And that is also something he's going to be thinking about. I wouldn't be surprised if you see him, Lloyd George, as much as his opinions on empire are interesting, pushing, especially one of the reasons why he'd be pushing this and wanting this to get up, set up, and a general staff and First Sea Lord, he'd also want that general staff to have staffs coordinating with the other navies of empire, the Dominion navies, so that they can be encouraged to buy more equipment and buy more goods. So expect Lloyd George to be pushing heavily for the Dominions to be buying more ships and boosting trade that way. And Britain, etc., and them to be investing more in cruisers as well. So all that's going to be a factor. All that's going to be going on because of what Lloyd George believes in and because of his effect on this scenario. He's going to be very different than the ministers who are there. And by the way, what I've done is I've taken the arguments to base this from, the cases he was making while as President of Board of Trade, the things he was arguing for, but now he's in the position of First Lord of the Admiralty. So instead of him arguing from the position of another cabinet member, he's able to argue from being the cabinet member responsible and given a reforming mandate. So he's going to be even harder at pushing. All these things add up. All these things have an impact, which is quite fun. So, what are the biggest potential changes that come from this? Now, very quickly, when you start to consider the biggest focus being on trade protection economics and the economic security the Navy can provide to Empire, it starts to become very clear to me that he's going to be focusing in on the battlecruisers. Because that's what Jackie Fisher is going to have to sell them to as. He's going to sell them as the economic warfare tool. He's going to sell basically the fleet as how you get control of the ocean, the battle fleet. These are how you exercise control of the ocean. These are how you keep trade flowing. But the thing is, that's probably going to work too well. Because Lloyd George, I love him dearly, but once he gets an idea in between his teeth, he's going to be pushing for it. And because of this, I think you'd actually have an increased order of battlecruisers. I think you would probably maybe keep to the free Invincibles. But I think definitely would be the free Indefatigables would definitely come to pass. And I think there'd be free Lions in his tenure ordered. And I think also, as he goes on to Chancellor Exchequer afterwards, and I can't imagine that changing much, you'd possibly even have 2 Queen Marys and 2 Tigers. And there is even the chance that with the growing cost of these ships, he pushes for the 9.2-inch gun cruisers. Now, why am I saying this? Well, because the arguments given for all of these, when you look into them in the Navy, are all about economics. But the MPs in charge, whether they're Winston Churchill or his predecessors, focus in on warfighting capability, control the sea, getting control of the sea. Lloyd George isn't like that. So I think this could lead to a very interesting scenario where you almost get into a habit of the Royal Navy ordering 4 battleships a year and 2 battle cruisers. Or maybe more. Maybe adjusting it depending on the scenario. Depending on how many the Germans are building. 4 to 5 battleships a year. Possibly it's going to be 5 battleships a year. That would fit with most of their classes. And a couple of battle cruisers. And that would be the odds of what they're ordering throughout this period. The reality in the best case scenario, I think, for the Navy is the Royal Navy finds itself with 3 Indefatigables, 3 Invincibles, 3 Indefatigables, 3 Lions, and the 2 Queen Marys and 2 Tigers. Possibly even getting 3 of both those, but that would be a very strange scenario where possibly he is then cutting into the battle fleet construction. And so the Royal Navy would find itself with these ships. Now, I don't think they'd all be Royal Navy. I think they'd be Royal Australian Navy, Royal Canadian Navy. I think that's how he would push them through. There might even be a Royal Indian Navy battlecruiser. That could be a possibility. He could say that, look, each of the Dominions is each going to get a battlecruiser. Like Australia, like HMAS Australia. And there is, of course, New Zealand as well. So, that's not without precedence. But he could push it further. Canada, India, get a couple. Get 1 each. And this would all be about trade protection. For Canada, there is an argument they need more than 1. They might need 2. And for Australia, certainly the same case can be made. And I could also see, as time goes on, him selling off the older ones, or suggesting the older ones be transferred to the Dominions on a reduced cost basis. They don't necessarily buy them; they pay the running cost for them, so that the Royal Navy budget goes down or doesn't increase, making a saving, but they still have access to this asset, this capability, and that's quite a strong possibility, I'd say. If you can imagine, if the Invincibles and the Indefatigables, especially if you did get 3 Lions and 3 Queen Marys ordered, and even 3 Tigers ordered, or just even the 2 and 2. If you think about it, the Royal Navy historically, the battle cruisers it has, were 10 ships. By the time World War I breaks out. Technically, Tigers commissioned October 1914, I know, but that's near enough, makes no difference in the scenario here. It's traditionally is 10 ships. Under this scenario, the Royal Navy could have 13 battle cruisers at its call. Now, admittedly, one of the 10 is HMS Australia, which is a Royal Australian Navy. And in this scenario, there would be a Canada. Britain actually, therefore, can be argued to have 9. But this scenario, there's 13 ships built, but Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India are all operating one. So Britain's still operating 9, but 4 are out on different positions around the world for trade and trade protection. Because again, that fits with the scenario of what he wanted, what he would like for trade protection, and what, honestly, Fisher would probably be able to sell him on. I wouldn't be surprised if, knowing the well, the way things work, India would end up with an Invincible, as would possibly Canada, because they would be the cheapest options for them to take over and run. Which could be interesting, but that also would mean that the Royal Navy itself would be left with one Invincible, maybe even oh no, zero Invincibles, with HMS New Zealand being in the Royal Navy service, whilst an Invincible class was actually given to the Royal New Zealand Navy if it was set up in this time period, which, again, he'd probably be pushing for it to be set up. So they would have an Invincible. The Invincible classes would be spread out to the various dominions. Australia would have their Indefatigable class, and the Royal Navy would be left with what? The two Indefatigables, three Lions, and the two Queen Marys at the beginning of World War One. At the beginning of World War One, in immediate capability, and possibly possibly a Tiger, soon available in October that year. Possibly both Tigers available in October that year. Who knows? The point is, the other vessels will be spread around the world, providing for trade protection, providing for security. I think this is a high likelihood. Okay? Once we start considering Lloyd George and his mindset once he gets involved things, he likes to do them properly. And doing them properly means he's going to be pushing this, and Fisher will take advantage of it. Will this cost more money? Yes, but if you're getting the Allied powers to get involved in it, it's going to be cheaper long term. I.e. the Dominion powers to get involved. It's going to be cheaper long term. The other scenario, of course, is South Africa. The Boer War has happened, but they are a Dominion. They do have size, and they are included steadily in the army projects. So again, Lloyd George, in a reforming mindset, might well push for them to be involved in a naval mindset, in the naval projects. And again, battle cruisers being given out to the to the Dominions, or them being encouraged to buy battle cruisers, actually fits better with the Royal Navy's requirements and the need for trade protection and defense of the Empire than them having battleships. Because if worse things come to the worse, a battleship you can use the force of battleships to enforce your will on a battle cruiser. But the other way around, it don't work that well. It would have an effect on the wider world, I have to say. A growth in battlecruiser numbers from Britain like this would have probably an effect on Germany. They'd be looking at procurement going, oh, frigate, the British have raced away. But again, building an extra 3 battlecruisers is not going to strain British infrastructure. It's really not in the years we're talking about. Is it going to have an effect on the Italians and the French? Probably not. The Americans and the Japanese are probably going to look at it and go, For Japan, because if India, Canada, and Australia all have a battle cruiser, especially if the Canadian battle cruiser ends up sitting on the Pacific coast, suddenly there's a problem. Suddenly there's the British have quite a lot of heavy-duty trade protection assets in this area. I think this is the biggest potential change. And it's really weird to be saying about someone who is so ardently cutting defense spending, but this also comes into cutting defense spending, because this is pushing more of the spending onto the Dominions to defend themselves, and it is protecting trade and economics. And that is what Lloyd George always valued. That is what Lloyd George was considered key. So the moment you start using those arguments to make the case for battlecruisers, and they fit into that slot, he's going to start pushing them through, and he's going to start asking questions, do we have enough? And the Royal Navy's never going to argue against an extra ship. They can make the case for the battleships based off the German production. They have no problems with that. That is something he's going to be forced into by literally the Germans and their numbers. And the same with tech growth, it's going to be the tech growth. That's fine. But battlecruiser numbers were never about Germany. They were always about Britain's global trade, Britain's presence. This is why there is a huge difference in numbers of battlecruisers in the Royal Navy versus battlecruisers in the German forces and other scenarios. So yeah, if you're putting that as the economic basis, then that's going to be a big, big change. And it's going to have an impact going forward. Which leads us to post-1908, when he is promoted to Chancellor. How does this continue to change things? Well, I'm going to start by, as I've done, sort of reading out this point and then starting from there. The Navy and Fisher may have gained a valuable ally. He still won't want to recklessly spend on war. I know I keep saying this, but I'm going to keep explaining and acknowledging it, but I'm also going to explain why I'm going further on the other way. But he'll probably have, having worked with the Navy closely for 4 years, understand their case a lot better. Interesting enough, this might mean we don't have the We-18 campaign. The reason I say that is because he might have got into the habit with the Royal Navy of pushing them to order a couple of battlecruisers, or at least one battlecruiser every year with a 5 capital ship order. So you order 5 battleships, you build a battlecruiser, or something like that. He might well have that as an ongoing policy. And if he's let that become a standard, well, then the Admiralty originally wanted 6 ships. So they might get 5 Queen Elizabeths and a battleship and a battlecruiser ordered, but then also might be getting 5 R's and a battlecruiser ordered. And those battlecruisers are probably 15-inch gun improved Tigers. This means no We-18 campaign. Okay? No We-18 campaign. The Royal Navy building 5 ships and a battlecruiser. But it changes the scenario, because you consider historically only 5 Queen Elizabeths and 5 R's actually enter service. And 2 15-inch gun battlecruisers enter service, Renown and Repulse. But in this scenario, you'd have 2 Tigers and 2 Tiger 15-inch gunships. Taking a Tiger design, a Tiger-star battlecruiser, which was not a battlecruiser 2-word, but a battlecruiser 1-word, and adding on 15-inch guns. Now, why am I again going with this? Because once you've set the standard, and you've got the standard modus operandi of what the acceptable spending is for the Royal Navy, and Lloyd George will have done this, is it 4 battleships and 2 battlecruisers, or is it 5 battleships and 1 battlecruiser? Probably it's the latter in each order set, because that fits with the Royal Navy, with the the ships they're ordering, with the number of ships they're building they've got into. It would fit with that scenario. And it would also fit with his policy of trade protection emphasized first. Now, what is going to be suffering in all this? Because the Royal Navy investing in battlecruisers, investing in destroyers, probably investing in anti-submarine warfare, because again it's trade protection, to an extent, as much as they do in this time period. What is going to be the big difference? Well, I would say the big difference, as these things start to come about, it's not going to be cost. The Navy estimates are not going to be much greater, because honestly, it's going to be the relationships he's built with the Empire that are going to be interesting. You see, pushing the construction of cruisers and some of the battle cruisers onto the Empire only works if you're giving them far better, far more regular briefings. Only works getting the army gets them to spend on growing their armies by doing those same briefings they're doing in the UK. The Royal Navy doesn't have that structure. So Lloyd George presenting that structure and positioning it forward, he's making the case. And will it win him votes immediately? No. Will it win him the argument immediately? No. But will it slowly shape the discussion? Yes. Because when even the people who are arguing against you are using your framework to argue against you, you have set the tone and shape of the battlefield. This is why control of language matters so much, and control of phraseology. If you're setting the words that are used, if you are setting the very framework that something is discussed through, the prism it is thought about through, you have already won half the battle. So that on his side, there will have been a growth, without an increase in naval spending by the British. What could this mean for the Royal Navy by World War One? Well, I've put up to 14 battlecruisers and battlecruisers, i.e. the two types. Battlecruiser, two word, is what dreadnought armor cruisers were supposed to be called. Battlecruisers are usually what we describe ships which are actually designed with some kind of fighting in mind. So they have greater subdivision than a battlecruiser, two word. They have greater armor coverage than a battlecruiser, two word. But what they usually don't have is they are not getting anywhere near a fast battleship or battleship in terms of their full. They don't have full armor coverage. They're still a battlecruiser in that terms. They don't have the level of subdivision even a fast battleship has, etc. Some with 13.5-inch guns, and two to probably enter quite soon, which have 15-inch guns. Increased government awareness of the Royal Navy's war plans. Perhaps the Committee of Imperial Defence has even managed to create a truly unified Army-Navy war plan for waging war against Germany. Now, the reason I bring this up is because of a guy called Sir George Clarke, who from 1904 to 1907 tried to create such plans in vain. The reason he lost was the only person who was supporting him cabinet was Haldane, and the Prime Minister was ignoring him. Well, this is the sort of idea which Lloyd George will like, because again, it's about getting efficiency of cost, efficiency of spending. So if that's going on, if that's the potential possibility, then in a nicest way, I can foresee, and certainly foresee, Lloyd George also backing him up. And if Lloyd George is backing him up as well as Haldane, then the Prime Minister probably has to listen. Because those two together are a scary formation. Now, what does this have an impact on World War One? Does this mean we change from an expeditionary strategy and the style in terms of what the French wanted? Probably not. The army and the British Army and the French wanted in terms of BF going to Europe. Probably not. But what it possibly does is produces a British expeditionary force and a Dominion expeditionary force. Let me explain. You have a Royal Marine Division, and you maybe have another British Army Division, but you also add on to that a Canadian Division, an Australian Division, maybe a division of New Zealanders, and a division of South Africans, and maybe an Indian Division. You group these together into some corps. You maybe produce a 3-corps formation, 3 divisions in each corps sort of scenario. And that becomes the Dominion Expeditionary Force, the DEF. Now, believe it or not, this again, I'm not talking out of my behind necessarily on this. This was actually a article, well, not so much an article, a notion I once read in a paper from the period. It didn't go anywhere. No one took it up. No one was interested in it, so it didn't go anywhere. Nothing happened. But again, you might have that as a secondary force, which the British will and Navy, with maybe appropriate landing ships or ships taken up for trade, thanks to the Fourth Sea Lord and his organisation of logistics and transport, will use to land elsewhere to open another theatre in a major war. And it would probably be viewed as something that, okay, we use it to go take out their colonies, we use it to go, do things elsewhere in the war effort we need to. This is this sort of scenario you start to think about. And you start to think about what the policy is going to be. Okay, we want the army the British Army and Expeditionary Force in France. We want them to be supported by the territorials and expanded. Okay, we want the navy to hold the North Sea. We want the other part of the navy with the DEF, let's call it, the Dominion Expeditionary Force or Empire Expeditionary Force, whatever you want to call it, the EEF, going out elsewhere in the world to take colonies away from the Germans and do the other duties we might need, and maybe expand the war effort elsewhere. I can see that being a very strong possibility as a way to compromise. And it's a compromise which we brought about because if you've got both the Navy and the Army competing in the same way for the minds, the mind space of the political leadership, it becomes a compromise. The Army gets what it wants, the Navy gets what it needs, and Britain gets the security it absolutely requires. It's a win-win. And best of all, the budget's not any different. It's just organisation. It's just staff work. And that's a good thing. That is a good thing. So what's the impact on World War I? Well, if you've added that many battle cruisers and that much organisation, it's going to change things dramatically. I mean, any battle like the Battle of Dogger Bank, well, you're unlikely to find 12-inch battle cruisers here. You're unlikely to find that. You are far more likely to find a scenario where you have at least, even if Queen Mary is out the way and others are out there, let's say 2 are still out the way, you think about how many 13.5-inch battle cruisers you'd have in this scenario. You'd have 7 to call from. Even if 2 are out the way, you've got 5 13.5-inch gun ships there. And possibly, if they start at the same time as Queen Elizabeth, then by the time of Dogger Bank, you could well have a 15-inch gun battlecruiser there as well. Now, the Germans have either had to build their forces up to respond to this, in which case, economically, they're in trouble, because it's going to cost them more money and possibly going to lead to a breakdown of the quantitative race earlier on, because frankly the quantitative race breaks when the army goes, the German army goes, you're nicking our budget now and you're not allowed to do that. We will happily indulge a navy being built as much as the Kaiser wants. The Kaiserlich Marine can do what it likes and grow as great as it likes, but the moment you impinge on the Heer's army and the Heer's budget, you're in trouble. You're gone. Which, if BT's still in charge, it might well work out the same. But there again, it might not. It might work out very differently because of them having the heavier, more powerful guns, and there being perhaps more of them, because there could be as many as 6 ships there. And if there is a 15-inch gun battlecruiser with the same fire control system that's put on the Queen Elizabeth's, BT's probably in that as his flagship, but also you then have 5 13.5-inch gunships, and you have you have other extra cruisers with them, and BT might still make the same mistake, but the firepower is going to be very different. But also the reality of any World War I is going to be very different once you're dealing with these extra ships and service. Because let's say it does start off with the Canadian Invincible sitting in Canada. Well, if any ship could potentially solo von Spey's fleet, it will be that. And if von Spey is not, that will first come down to maybe cover Panama, but then it'll be coming south. And that changes that scenario for von Spey. Does von Spey, think about the scenario. There's a battlecruiser in the ocean. There's a battlecruiser in the Southeast Asia, and there's a battlecruiser on the in the Eastern Pacific. what does he do? He might still do the same route, it's still the best option for him. But there's a trapdoor closing a lot more quickly. A lot more quickly. Even for the von Moltke and getting through the Mediterranean, those extra ships wandering around are going to have an impact. Where are they? What are they doing? So, realistically, we can't really predict how World War I would go in this scenario. We can't. But I can say this. The weirdest thing for me was when working this out and going through this question and working it through was that Lloyd George put him in the right position because of his tendencies for research, for thoroughness, and for, applying his mind to what's being constructed and what's being done, and his desire to communicate with his colleagues what he's doing so they do what they do, back him up in the way he wants them to. It's one of the reasons why he managed to run the coalition government he does for so long so effectively. Well, it could actually lead to the Royal Navy being bigger and stronger in World War I than it was historically, and a whole lot better prepared. And British strategy as a whole, much better prepared. And that's a fun thing to think about. So, here's the question. And the question is a simple one. Let's say things continue as they did historically. Let's say things happened similarly. There was a Battle of Jutland, there's a Battle of Dogger Bank, or maybe there's just a Battle of Dogger Bank and the Germans lose so many of their scouting group they don't try again for a Battle of Jutland style operation, they go other ways. But World War I works out as it does historically, and the war ends. What do you think the post-World War I world goes like in this scenario? Because having spent now nearly a decade training those governments, those Dominion powers in the value of sea power, and giving them their own battlecruisers and them using them and successfully, you don't just have Australia to manage, you'd have others. How does the Washington Naval Treaty go? How do you think the post-World War I world is different? Because I think it would be tremendously different. I really do. I think some of the agreements which were made in Washington Treaty wouldn't actually fly in this scenario. I really do think they would fall flat. But I'd like to hear your opinion. I'd like to hear what you think. Anyway, what have we got coming? Well, when this video finally comes out, and I'll just check, on the 16th of August, well, the Tuesday video is going to be the École Navale. Oh, that'll be fun. How does that come about? How does the new school come about? And how does École Navale, the French naval academy, help train modern leaders? It's going to be a fun one. It is. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed. Take care. And please, if you like the videos, please do like, share, and subscribe. And patron suggestions are always welcome. I do a thing of so people can try with Patreon things. I sometimes make them, especially for the big ones, it's a £3, so it's the same as a monthly fee to go and log in and, be and see to put your own suggestions there. But yeah, that's the thing. And that's the thing. Being a patron is very, very kind. Being a member is very, very kind. All this stuff to support the channel is incredibly. People watch the adverts. Seriously, so kind. Making it possible to do this, I can't thank you enough. Take care, and hope you enjoyed the video.